بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله حمدا كثيرا يوافي نعمه ويكافئ مزيده والصلاة والسلام على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. May peace and blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be with all of you. This is episode number 5 of The Last Station by Marcel Kraf from his YouTube videos, which came in his native German language and was translated to Arabic. In turn, I have tried here to translate it to English. We had 4 episodes and this is the 5th. We're going to continue until the 8th. Eventually, inshallah, I'm going to summarize them, do a conclusion. These episodes, as you have seen in the last 4, are long and drawn out, especially this one, the 5th one. But I have liked his approach in dealing with life's most important issues and his use of commonsensical approaches that provokes the listener to take a decision and think about those important issues or aspects of life. This without sounding a preacher. He does not invoke too much literature, but brings commonsensical, everyday examples of life. We have 3 more episodes to go. And as I said, I'll do a conclusion at the end of the 8th episode. In part 1, he calls it a life train. He talks about the beginning and the end of life, the inevitability of death, the value of life, the reality and the eventuality of death, and how human beings are forgetful and they do not tend to focus on those important things and adjust their life accordingly. In episode number 2, he raised the question of intelligent creator and how modern man has lost his campus and attachment to the creator. He talks about justice and how there is no absolute justice on earth and how an absolute justice would turn life on earth an undesirable life. He talks about the beginning of our universe and the logical conclusion that whatever has a beginning would also have an end. Nothing could only produce nothing. He discusses some aspects of the intelligent design and creation of our universe. He debunks the notion that the universe was created from nothing and is coincidental. In part 3, he talks about, again, the purpose of life and the blueprint that was sent to mankind, prophethood and the guidance that came with the prophets. He talks about the universe and how it follows a pre-programmed system and how if the earth or the universe deviates an inch from the prescribed programmed system, disaster would ensue. Similarly, he says human beings should follow the blueprint and the guidance that came with the prophets. Even though man was given the choice and the free will, not following that blueprint and guidance would lead to a similar disaster. He talks about the successive prophethood that came to mankind, and he says there was a need to change the laws from time to time, even though in its core, the core value of what they were sent with is the same. The message did not change. It's the message of Islam. Each one of the prophets was sent with a specific guidance, but in its core value is the same. He resembles this, or he gives an example of traffic laws. He says in 1965 there was a different traffic law somewhere, anywhere, take any example. And from time to time, with the complication of lifestyle, the change in lifestyle, there will be a need to change the traffic law. No one can say I'm going to follow the traffic law of 1965. He would be in violation. And similarly, prophets came with successive guidance and law. And then he ends it with the prophethood of Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him, and how it's logic for it to be the last guidance that came from him. Now in part 4, he goes to mention how non-Muslim writers and philosophers viewed the message of Islam and the prophet of Islam, or of a prophet of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to be the right message, and the message that he came with to be the best among all. He mentions Michael Hart. He says in 1978, Michael Hart, in his famous book 100 most influential personalities in history, he chose Prophet Muhammad to be among the top, number one. He says Prophet Muhammad is the only one who built both a worldly and a spiritual system. Lamartine in 1854 and Annie Besant in 1932 concluded, reached to the same conclusion. From a simple beginning with a history of Arabia at that time and an illiterate person to come with such a book and a message, they say is a sign of truthfulness. In part 4, Marcel asks a question: what would be the motive of Prophet Muhammad to lie? And he goes in depth about it. And he talks about his life's trials and accomplishments and with his enemies, the Quraysh, before Islam spread and controlled a third of the world in less than 100 years. Now we'll go to part 5. It's a long episode, but it's something that will be enjoyable and thought-provoking to the reader. He starts saying that I will read a poem for you. Rabbit, oh rabbit, you, only 2 ears and a chest, the rest of your body you dig with it. What do you think of this? Strange, isn't it? I have one more. The elephant, what an elephant. What do you know about the elephant? It has a long tail and a long trunk and is a tiny bit of what our Lord's creation. This also is not any better. This looks as if one of my kids wrote it, but what is astonishing, a kid did not write this poem, but men from a community that brought the best poets of our time. The issue is not they were incapable of writing a better poem. They were masters in their field, and they have indeed written some great pieces of poetry. This has been the result when they tried to invent a new thing, a thing that was new to the world of poetry at that time, a unique and a sole genre of literature that cannot be classified according to the literature style of the time. These people were Arabs who lived before 1400 years ago. In the Arabic literature, there is only one book that came with this type of literature, and no type that had never been there. It cannot be classified as one of the known literatures, and this is the Qur'an. To Muslims, the Qur'an is the inspired word of Allah. It is not an intuition or a probable reformulation of meaning, but as we believe the direct words of Allah that He inspired. It is not the formulation of a human being, therefore it has a very distinct method and cannot be compared to any other sacred books. It's a guidance to mankind. At the same time, it is not a series of commandments. The verses that have characteristics of a commandment exhibit direct orders are at most 500, or an overall 10% of the Quran. And what remains is wisdom, stories, lessons that help human beings adhere to these orders. And this makes the construction of the Quran unique. When one says the Quran is the word of Allah, and a direct inspiration from Him, and no human hand has ever changed a letter from it or of it, is because some specific expectations is related to it. If my son would write a poem or a story, someone can recognize it by its style. Someone would read it but do not have to know my son is the one who wrote it. However, he would conclude that a child is the writer, even if he did not know in advance. The matter is related to the choice of words and the construction of the sentences and the textual complexity. It's possible to distinguish it from what an adult person would write. So is when someone reads a work of a professional writer. One would easily distinguish this from a writing of a person with no experience. A person would easily know the difference through the style of writing. This exactly is what one expects when reading the words of Allah. This has to be written in a human language, otherwise it would have no meaning. But at the same time, it must have been formulated in a way that surpasses all the rest. As it is easy to discriminate between a professional writer's works from an amateur one, so is the distinction between the words of Allah and that of a human being. All right, let's investigate then the reason that propelled the Arabs to write these poems, and why didn't they succeed in following the Quranic style of writing. The Arabic language, perhaps as all other languages, can be separated into two broad divisions. The first is prose, the plain statements, the stories written, the novels, and the mystery tales, and the newsreels. Even the normal conversation is considered as prose. The second big division is the poem. It's also part of literature. It's written in verses, and this is what mostly distinguishes. Most of the time is associated with rhyme, but not always so. These are the two main divisions, prose and poem. The Arabs divided the poem into 16 sections, and at the time it was called bihar. They chose this word to indicate the change in division, as in the Mawj al-Bahr. And any Arabic literature work that we know today, and even before the advent of Islam, clearly falls under one of these divisions. It's either a prose or one of the types of poem. The only exception is the Qur'an. That's why we still have today a specific classification for the Qur'an. Therefore, the Arabic language is the language of the three divisions, the prose, the poem, and the Qur'an. This division is not a means of showing reverence to the Qur'an, but it is because the Qur'an does not show resemblance to any of the other two. The Qur'an is written in verses. Therefore, someone may say it resembles poetry, but try to fit it to any of the 16 sections of poetry, you would find no resemblance to any of them. All these sections have distinct rules where someone can easily identify if any work of literature conforms to any one of them. But at the same time, the Quran tells many stories which brings it closer to prose. However, when someone looks into the definition of prose and compares it with the Quran, would find no resemblance. It's neither this nor that. It's truly a separate division. People tried to imitate it at the time. They thought that if the Quran is written in this format and was written by a human, as they used to believe, then we can produce similar works. What is interesting is anytime they tried to write, they wrote some strange sayings. They came up with these strange poems. Rabbit or rabbit. Yes, this could be called something that does not fit one of the two forms of writing, but it is nonsense. Therefore, it's possible to classify any Arabic literature to be one of prose, poem, or nonsense, except the Quran, which is the only book that has distinguished itself out of all the literature classification. This has been mentioned as a challenge to others in the Quran. When they say it at the beginning, this was written by a person or a poem or someone is feeding him with these verses. It's mentioned in the Quran that if you think it was written by a human, then come with a book that resembles it. Definitely you would be able to produce similar Quran if you think it is written by a human, if not a complete book. You would be able to produce 10 similar chapters. Some chapters are short, some with only 3 lines. No doubt this should be possible to do. When someone writes a book, and anyone who challenged the work should be able to at least produce some similar verses. 10 chapters may also be too much of a challenge. But one chapter, only one chapter. This has been mentioned in the Quran as a challenge. If you say this is not the speech of Allah, produce one chapter similar to that of the Quran, which is a challenge applicable to today. That is, if someone says that someone has authored this book, then let them come with only one chapter similar. The Quran is here since 1400 years, and until today, there is nothing that can compare with one chapter from it. These days, we see many that would want to refute Islam. They spend overwhelming efforts to prove that. This could be a simple challenge. 3 chapters similar to that of the Quran, and the challenge would be met in its entirety. Why spend all this money? Come up with only 3 lines. This challenge is applicable for today. The Quran, in an amazing way, challenged both the prose and the poem. It's written in verses with what resembles the rhymes of poetry. What distinguishes poetry is it contains very few information. It's not possible for a person to envision for a science book, for example, a biology book, to be written in a form of poetry. However, theoretically, it can be tried. Let's say I want to describe a tree in a biology book in a form of poetry. The tree, someone can hardly believe it has a bark. I find it green in color to a great extent. I'm not a great poet, but this is what someone could find written in a biology book written in a form of poetry. Some would note that these phrases contain very little information. All what we wanted to say was that the tree has green bark, which could be formulated with ease. If someone wants to write information in a form of poetry, it would for sure be a cumbersome work. He would be forced to stuff too many words so that it rhymes. This without adding meaning to it. This is what distinguishes poetry. It has beautiful rhymes, but contains very little information. Prose usually are the opposite. A person here does not focus on the beauty and the rhyme and can cite more information. The Qur'an conforms to both. It has a beautiful rhyme to the ear, as in poetry, but surpasses it, and at the same time, it contains plenty of information, as in prose, and surpasses it also. It is the only book that combined between the two in this form. If a person says the Quran surpasses poetry, or says it has a methodology that cannot be matched or simulated, and also a discernible beauty, it would not be a surprise if it came from a Muslim. This is obvious and self-evident. Perhaps all adherents of a religion would say the same on their book. What is surprising is for the enemies of Islam to say the same on the Quran. This is most genuine and sincere praise. To get praised by your own group is normal, but to get praise from your enemy, you better be sure it is sincere. The Arabs then knew what they meant. They were experts in literature and poetry. They were overwhelmed by the beauty of this book. They could not deny its beauty when read to them. In one instance, when all the enemies of Islam were in a gathering and the Prophet read a surah that has a sajda in it, they all listened with fascination and fell down prostrating with the Prophet. When the Prophet was reciting the Quran at night, enemy leaders would covertly come and listen to his recitation. They would panic when they see each other there. At one time, they said if people see us here, they would think we have followed him. However, they could never deny the Quran's beauty. There was a distinguished Arab poet, Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, considered one of the best of his time. The poets of the time had a special type of poetry called hijab, the satire, used to insult and humiliate others, similar to what we know today as rap competition. They were experts on this, and when they pick on one or when they pick on you, you would have no way but to migrate. At one time, they sent Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira to do same with Quran. Listen to it and do some satirical work so that people may stop following the Quran. He agreed. He went to the Prophet to listen to some Quran where the Prophet recited to him one ayah. Al-Walid sat down and asked the Prophet to repeat the ayah to him, which he did. Only one verse. He asked the Prophet again to repeat it to him, and he did. Al-Walid, who came to make satire on the Quran, eventually says, "By Allah, no one of you is more versed in poetry than me, and no one can compete against me. By Allah, Muhammad's words do not resemble any from what I know. His words are sweet and they're full of grace, is fruitful and productive from above, and is bestowing from below. It certainly is superior and nothing overrides. It shatters whatever is under." This from the best poet of history. Those who sent Al-Mughira were taken by despair and hopelessness. They were waiting for him to say something that would end this issue. Though Al-Mughira was an enemy and died as such, this was his testimony on he could not say anything. The effect of Al-Quran is clearly seen at its best on enemies of Islam who later become Muslim. We have the story of Umar, the second caliph of Islam. He once got out of home to assassinate the Prophet. He saw what Islam has done to his community. There were some whom he considered as radical followers who left the religion of their ancestors, which he wanted to put an end to. He drew out his sword and vowed to end Islam. On his way, he heard that his own sister has accepted Islam. He goes to her house, and when he approached near the door, he heard what he thought was recitation of Al-Quran, a form that he was not familiar with. He entered the house and started shouting to his sister. He regretted his deed after he struck his sister to the point of bleeding. He stops and asks for calm discussion. He asks his sister to show him what she was reciting. He listens to the first few verses of the 20th chapter of Al. The person who a few minutes before was planning to assassinate the Prophet decides to accept this. He listened to few verses from the chapter, but this was enough to convince him that it was the truth. He immediately goes to the Prophet and declares Islam. This is not an isolated story that happened at that time, but this is continuously happening today. There is an American Muslim named Abdullah. He has memorized the Qur'an. He tells his story of how he accepted it. His name was Mike. He was not the regular American, but was from the new Nazi group, a group that propounded the superiority of the white race. A very radical, and there is no even a chance of this happening to it at any time. Let's assume that there is a book bomb that will destroy all paper, an electronic book. Only the Muslims would be the only ones that would restore their book within one day. Today, we have millions of Muslim children who memorize the Quran entire, every ayah in the Quran. You see this with when someone recites from the Quran and makes a mistake. You will immediately find someone. The end. Thank you.